There is a question almost nobody asks themselves until it is far too late to answer it comfortably. What if the thing you have been calling your life was actually just a rehearsal you never stopped rehearsing? What if every single day you have spent bracing against things you cannot change, replaying arguments that already ended, chasing approval from people who forgot your name by dinner, was never actually living at all, just a very convincing imitation of it? Somewhere around 2,000 years ago, in the middle of plagues, exile, slavery, and war, a handful of thinkers figured out the answer to that question, and they figured it out the hard way, not in libraries but in prison cells and on battlefields and in the wreckage of everything they had ever built. They called their answer Stoicism, and it was never meant to be comfortable. It was meant to work when nothing else did. Modern neuroscience has spent the last few decades quietly proving what these men understood without a single brain scan. Your brain does not respond to the world as it actually is. It responds to the story your prefrontal cortex tells about the world, milliseconds after your amygdala has already decided whether to panic. The event and your reaction to the event are two entirely separate processes happening in two entirely different parts of your skull, and almost nobody is ever taught to notice the gap between them. The Stoics noticed it first, without any equipment at all, just brutal honesty about their own minds. And what follows are 10 of the sharpest tools they ever built from that noticing, rebuilt here for a life that looks nothing like ancient Rome but feels, underneath all the modern noise, exactly the same. Picture a sailor standing at the wheel of a small boat in open water, watching a storm build on the horizon that he has absolutely no power to stop, slow down, or redirect. He cannot calm the swells. He cannot silence the wind. He cannot bargain with the sky. The only thing that has ever been within his control, the only thing that will ever be within his control, is how tightly he holds the wheel and how steady he keeps his own hands while the water does whatever it was always going to do regardless of his opinion about it. Epictetus, a man who lived years of his life in chains before he ever tasted a single day of freedom, built his entire teaching around this exact distinction, and he built it because he had to, because there was nothing else left for a man in shackles to control except the inside of his own mind. Some things are up to us, he said, and some things simply are not, and confusing the two categories is the root of almost every unnecessary suffering a human being will ever carry. Your reputation belongs to other people's opinions, which means it was never yours in the first place. The outcome of your effort belongs to 100 variables you will never see or influence. Other people's choices, the traffic on the road, the weather on the day you needed it to be different, none of it was ever yours to grip, and yet most of us spend staggering amounts of our one limited life gripping exactly these things as if enough force of will could bend them into submission. What is actually yours is smaller than you think and far more powerful than you have been told. Your judgment in this exact moment. Your response to whatever just happened. Your next choice. That is the entire territory you have ever actually owned, and it has always been enough, because it was the only thing that was ever going to decide whether you drowned in the storm or steered straight through it. There is a practical exercise worth running the next time you feel your knuckles going white around something you cannot actually touch. Ask yourself one plain question. Can I act on this directly, right now, with my own two hands? Or can I only watch it and hope? If the honest answer is the second one, the grip you are holding is not protection. It is simply exhaustion with nothing to show for it, hour after hour, day after day, while the one thing you could actually be building, your own character, your own next move, sits completely untouched, waiting for the attention you keep spending somewhere else entirely. There is a second, quieter layer to this that most people never reach, because reaching it requires giving up something oddly comforting. Once you stop fighting the storm, you lose the storm as an excuse. You are left standing in a silence that used to be filled with blame, and in that silence sits your own uncontested responsibility, waiting patiently for you to finally pick it up. Most people avoid that silence for years, sometimes for an entire lifetime, because blaming the weather is so much easier than steering the boat. But the sailor who finally stops cursing the wind is the only sailor who ever actually learns to sail. Now picture something entirely different. A carpenter walking past the same warped, knotted plank of wood every single day for years, a plank every other carpenter in the shop calls ruined, useless, a waste of good timber. Then one afternoon a storm tears through the yard and every straight, uniform plank splits clean down the middle from the pressure, every single one except the warped plank, because the very knots and twists that made it look flawed had also made it flexible enough to bend under pressure instead of snapping outright. Nothing about that plank changed in the storm. Only the judgment resting on top of it changed, and with that one shift, everything about how it was seen changed completely. This is the second brutal insight worth carrying with you today. It is never the raw event that wounds you. It is the verdict you silently pass on that event, usually within a fraction of a second, without evidence, without a trial, without any real chance of appeal. Someone cancels plans and in an instant you have ruled that you are unwanted. You lose a job and just as fast you have ruled that you are worthless. The event happened out in the world. The wound happened entirely inside your own private courtroom, and you were the only one holding the gavel the whole time. This is precisely the mechanism cognitive behavioral therapy would eventually build an entire discipline around centuries later, the discovery that our automatic thoughts are not facts, they are habits of interpretation, grooved into the brain through repetition, and habits, unlike facts, can be retrained. Strip away the opinion you immediately wrapped around what happened to you, and look honestly at what is actually left underneath it. Usually it is smaller and far more survivable than the story you built in the space of one panicked heartbeat. You do not have to accept every verdict your mind hands down the instant something goes wrong. You are allowed to appeal. You are allowed to ask whether this is actually true, or simply the fastest, most familiar way your mind knows how to suffer, because it has rehearsed suffering this exact way 1,000 times before and never once been challenged on it. Consider how much of your own personal history has been quietly shaped not by what actually happened to you, but by the earliest verdict you happened to pass on it, sometimes as a child far too young to appeal any ruling at all. One offhand comment from a parent, absorbed once and treated ever since as permanent fact. One failure in front of classmates, filed away as a life sentence about your own ability. The event lasted seconds. The verdict has been serving time for years, sometimes decades, completely unexamined, simply because nobody ever told you the courtroom was still open for appeal. There is an old image worth sitting with here too, a blacksmith holding raw iron over open flame in the dark of his forge. The iron does not choose the fire. It cannot escape the heat, cannot negotiate with the hammer that is about to fall on it again and again, cannot decide it would rather stay soft and shapeless in some safe corner forever. And yet it is precisely that unwanted violence, that unchosen pressure, that turns shapeless metal into something strong enough to hold an edge, strong enough to be trusted with real weight in the real world. Marcus Aurelius, a man who ruled an empire through plague, war, and betrayal by people he trusted, wrote to himself in the middle of the night, in a journal never meant for anyone else's eyes, that the obstacle in the path becomes the path itself, that whatever blocks the action can become the action. This was not a comforting slogan. It was a working method he used to survive years that would have broken almost anyone else who ever wore a crown that heavy. Every difficulty placed in front of him was treated, deliberately and forcibly, as material to be worked, never as punishment sent to destroy him. Most people treat hardship as proof the universe has singled them out. A relationship ends and they read it as evidence they are unlovable. A venture fails and they read it as evidence they were never capable. But the iron does not read the fire as proof it was never meant to become a blade. The fire is simply the mechanism through which shapeless material becomes something with a purpose. Your setbacks are not verdicts on your worth, no matter how convincingly they disguise themselves as one in the moment. More often than not, they are the exact temperature required to forge whatever you are actually becoming, whether you asked for that temperature or not. This does not mean pretending the pain is not real, because that would be its own kind of lie. The iron genuinely burns. The next time life throws you into heat you never asked for, ask yourself the blacksmith's question instead of the victim's question. Not why is this happening to me, a question the universe will never answer. Ask instead, what shape is this heat trying to force out of me? Because something is always being shaped in that moment, whether you cooperate with it or resist it every step of the way. There is a version of you on the other side of every fire you have ever walked through, and that version did not exist before the heat touched you. You cannot meet them by avoiding the forge. You can only meet them by staying in the flame long enough to be reshaped by it. Now think about two apprentices who begin their training on the same day, with the same raw talent, in the same city. One is placed among craftsmen who demand precision and honesty in every joint of wood they cut. The other is placed among men who cut corners, lie to customers, and mock anyone foolish enough to try doing the work properly. 10 years pass. Neither apprentice consciously chose who they became. They simply absorbed, invisibly, day after day, the standard of the room they happened to spend their working hours inside. Seneca warned his students about exactly this contagion nearly 2,000 years before modern social psychology confirmed it in controlled studies on behavioral mimicry. We never leave certain company, he said, with the same character we brought into it, the way a healthy man can catch a fever simply from breathing the same air as someone sick, without ever being touched at all. Character is not built alone in a quiet room with your own good intentions. It is built inside rooms, among people, and most of us never once audit the rooms we spend our entire lives standing in. There is a reason some rooms feel exhausting to leave and others feel energizing to leave, even when nothing dramatic happened in either one. The exhausting room was quietly asking you to shrink to fit it. The energizing room was quietly asking you to grow to meet it. Ask yourself honestly what standard the handful of rooms you spend the most time in are training you to treat as normal. If the people around you treat mediocrity as acceptable, some part of you is being trained to accept mediocrity too, no matter how loudly you insist otherwise inside your own head. This is not a call to burn every bridge tonight in some dramatic act of self-improvement, and it is not permission for cruelty toward people who have disappointed you. It is a call to honesty about what proximity is doing to you, silently, every single day, whether you are paying attention or not. There is also a mirror side to this most people conveniently forget. You are not only a passenger absorbing the standards around you. You are also, whether you intend it or not, writing a line into every character standing near you. The choice to raise your own standard is never purely selfish, because the rooms you stand in are shaping you while you are just as quietly shaping them back. Picture a runner standing at the edge of a cold track before sunrise, every instinct in her body pulling her back toward the warm bed she just left. The track does not care how tired she feels this morning. Her competition is not waiting for her to feel ready. The only variable she actually controls is whether she shows up to meet the day before the day has already decided everything without her. Marcus Aurelius wrote about arguing with himself over this exact pull, the temptation of the warm blanket instead of rising to do the work he considered himself born to do as a human being with a finite number of mornings left. If the most powerful man in the known world had to talk himself out of bed some mornings, you are not weak for feeling that same pull. You are simply human, exactly as he was underneath the title. Notice what he actually did with the pull instead of losing to it. He did not indulge it, and he did not shame himself for feeling it either, because shame rarely gets anyone out of bed faster than it needs to. He asked himself a sharper question than the blanket was asking. The blanket asks whether it would feel better to stay warm a few more minutes. The sharper question asks what you were actually made for, and whether staying warm is really the answer worth giving yourself this particular morning. Most mornings the blanket wins by default simply because nobody bothers asking the sharper question before reaching for the snooze button. Winning the first hour of your day is rarely about gritted teeth willpower dragged out of nowhere. It is about deciding the night before which question gets to win in the morning, before you are even tired enough to negotiate with yourself. This matters more than it first appears, because the way you meet the very first hour sets the tone your mind uses to interpret every hour that follows it. Lose the first hour, and you spend the rest of the day in an apologetic catch-up posture, chasing a version of the day that already got away from you. Win it, even by a small margin, and every hour afterward inherits an advantage it did not have to earn on its own. Tomorrow morning, before you reach for the excuse already waiting for you, ask yourself the sharper question. What were you actually born to do today, with the limited number of mornings you have left? And is 5 more minutes of warmth really worth trading it for? Pause here for a moment, because if you have made it this far, Something in what you just heard is already working on you whether you have noticed it or not. Most people let something like this wash over them for 20 minutes and return tomorrow to exactly the life they were living before they pressed play. That is not a judgment against you. It is simply the ordinary gravity every human being fights against, the pull back toward the familiar even after the familiar has stopped serving them. Ask yourself honestly which of these first 5 ideas landed the hardest, and why. Usually the one that stings the most is not a coincidence. It is pointing directly at the exact place in your life where you have been quietly avoiding the truth for longer than you would like to admit, even to yourself. If any part of this is already sitting differently in your chest than it was 10 minutes ago, that is worth paying attention to, because the next 5 lessons go somewhere even the Stoics themselves considered the hardest ground to stand on, the ground of loss, mortality, and the applause you were never actually owed. Subscribe before you go anywhere else today, because the second half of this is going to ask more of you than the first half did, and it deserves to find you when it is ready, not lost in a feed you forgot to come back to. There was once a trader who, before every single voyage, forced himself to sit quietly at home and imagine the worst possible version of what could happen out on the water. The storm that sinks the ship without warning. The cargo lost forever to the ocean floor. Years of accumulated work erased in one bad night of weather nobody could have predicted. His rivals thought him strange, even cursed, for dwelling on disaster before it had any chance to actually happen. But when disaster eventually did strike, as it strikes everyone eventually no matter how carefully they plan, he was the only one among them who did not fall apart completely, because some part of him had already survived this exact loss 100 times over in the privacy of his own mind before it ever touched his real life. The Stoics practiced a deliberate version of this, sitting with the possibility of losing what they loved most, not to invite misfortune closer, but to strip fear of its single greatest weapon, the element of surprise. Seneca wrote that nothing should ever come as a shock to someone who has properly prepared themselves, that we should send our minds ahead into every possible difficulty on the road so that when difficulty actually arrives, we greet it as something rehearsed rather than something that ambushes us while our guard is down. Most people do the exact opposite. They avoid even the thought of loss, as though thinking about it might somehow summon it into being, and so when loss inevitably comes anyway, it arrives as a total stranger they never once prepared to meet. This is not pessimism, no matter how similar it sounds on the surface. A pessimist expects disaster, and does nothing at all to prepare for it emotionally, simply waits helplessly to be crushed by whatever comes. This is closer to a soldier checking every buckle on his armor before a battle he sincerely hopes never actually arrives. You do not check the buckles because you want the fight to come. You check them because if it comes anyway, despite every hope otherwise, you would rather meet it standing on solid ground than meet it caught completely off guard. There is a particular kind of freedom hidden inside this practice that is easy to overlook. Once you have honestly sat with the worst outcome and found that you are still standing inside that thought, something in you quietly relaxes for the first time in years. You stop spending daily energy defending against the catastrophe you were secretly terrified even to name. The catastrophe has already been named, examined, and survived in imagination, and what remains is simply the ordinary work of living, unburdened by the weight of an unspoken fear. Try sitting once this week with the honest thought of losing something you currently take for granted, whether it is your health, a relationship, or the life you have built, not to torture yourself on a loop, but to notice with genuine relief that you are still standing even inside the thought of it. There is a strange side effect that shows up once this becomes a regular practice. The things you have honestly rehearsed losing become, paradoxically, things you appreciate far more while you still have them. The sailor who has imagined the ship going down watches the sunrise from its deck differently than the sailor who has never once let himself consider it. Real gratitude rarely arrives on its own. It arrives on the back of a clear-eyed look at how easily everything you currently hold could be taken from you tomorrow. There was once a musician who spent years building his entire sense of worth around the size of the crowd gathered to hear him play each evening. On nights the crowd was large and generous, he felt invincible, certain of his own talent and his place in the world. On nights the hall was half empty, he felt like a fraud who had wasted his life on a gift nobody actually wanted. It took him decades to notice something devastating about the whole arrangement. His skill had never once changed based on the size of the crowd. Only his sense of himself had, and he had spent years handing complete strangers the power to decide whether he was allowed to feel proud of his own two hands. Epictetus taught his students to draw a hard, unforgiving line between what belongs to us and what belongs entirely to other people's opinions of us, and applause belongs entirely to the second category. No matter how good it feels in the moment, it was never yours to begin with. It arrives and departs based on moods, trends, and circumstances that have nothing to do with the actual worth of the work you did that day. The moment you build your identity on top of applause, you have quietly handed over the deed to your own self-worth to a crowd that will change its mind about you before the week is even over. This does not mean indifference to whether your work is genuinely good, because that is not what any of this is about. It means the measure of whether your work is good should live inside your own honest, demanding standards, not inside the fluctuating size of whoever happens to be watching on a given evening. Ask yourself honestly, without flattering your own answer, how much of what you do each day is aimed at genuine excellence, and how much is secretly aimed at being seen doing something that merely looks like excellence to whoever happens to be watching. The two are not the same thing, even though they can look identical from the outside for a very long time. Only one of them will still feel worth doing on the day the crowd finally stops watching entirely, and eventually, for every single one of us without exception, it does stop. There is a quiet test worth running on yourself here. Imagine the exact piece of work you are proudest of, but imagine that not a single person will ever know you were the one who made it. Does it still feel worth having made? If the answer is yes, you have found something real, something that belongs to you the way the Stoics meant it. If the answer is no, you have found, gently and without judgment, a place where the applause had quietly become the whole point. Build the version of your work that would still feel worth having even if no one ever clapped for it again as long as you lived. That version, and only that version, was ever really yours to keep. There was once an old instrument maker who spent his entire working life building precise mechanisms to measure time for other people, intricate devices that ticked away the hours of strangers he would never personally meet, while somehow never once turning that same precision toward his own remaining days. On the morning he finally understood with total clarity that his own time had nearly run out, he did not feel the despair he expected to feel. He felt something closer to relief, because for the first time in decades every remaining hour suddenly mattered enormously, and he stopped wasting the ones he had left on things that had never deserved them. Seneca made a claim that still unsettles people today, nearly 2,000 years after he first wrote it down. Most of life is not lost through some single dramatic tragedy, he argued. It is lost quietly, a day at a time, handed away to distraction, delay, and the comfortable assumption that there will always be more of it later. We do not actually have a short life, he wrote. We simply waste a great deal of the one we were given, and the waste is so gradual that most people never notice the hourglass emptying until there is almost nothing left inside it to notice. Looking honestly at your own mortality is not the morbid exercise most people assume from the outside. It is closer to what the instrument maker finally did, turning his precision toward his own remaining time instead of only ever measuring everyone else's. When you actually let yourself feel, for even one honest minute, that your days are numbered and that number is entirely unknown to you, something remarkable happens almost immediately. The petty argument stops feeling worth having. The apology you have been withholding out of pride suddenly feels urgent. The work you have been postponing for some days suddenly demands, quietly but insistently, to be started today instead. This is not about becoming afraid of death or letting that fear paralyze the very life you are trying to protect. It is about using the plain fact of death as a filter for everything you do while you are still fortunate enough to be alive to do it. Would this argument matter on the final day of your life? Would this grudge you have carried for years? Would this fear that has quietly shaped so many of your decisions without your even noticing? Most of what currently feels enormous shrinks almost instantly once placed next to the true, undeniable size of the hourglass. There is a particular kind of courage that only becomes available once you have looked honestly at your own mortality, a courage that has nothing to do with recklessness and everything to do with clarity. Look at your own remaining time honestly just once this week, then spend what is left of it like someone who finally understood it was never unlimited to begin with. Picture an ancient walled city under siege, arrows raining down on the outer walls night after night, the enemy trying every possible method to break through before winter arrives. But somewhere deep inside that city, protected by wall after wall, sits an inner chamber no siege has ever managed to reach, a place the attackers cannot touch no matter how long they camp outside the gates, because it was never built anywhere their weapons could reach in the first place. The Stoics described something remarkably similar living inside every human being who has ever walked the earth, an inner citadel that external circumstances cannot storm unless we ourselves open the gate and let them in. Insults, setbacks, betrayal by people you trusted, all of it can hammer against the outer walls of your life relentlessly, and none of it can actually touch the innermost chamber, your judgment, your character, your capacity to choose how you respond, unless you personally hand over the key to whoever happens to be attacking that day. Most people live as though every insult, every unkind word from a stranger, has already breached the inner chamber, has already reached the part of them that decides who they fundamentally are. But notice, if you look closely, how often the actual damage was self-inflicted, not by the enemy outside the walls at all, but by the gatekeeper inside who panicked in the noise and threw the gates open without ever actually being forced to. Building this inner fortress does not happen by accident, and does not happen overnight, no matter how badly you want it to. It is built one deliberate stone at a time, through the small unglamorous daily practice of noticing when you are about to hand over the key, and choosing instead, in that exact moment, to hold on to it a little longer. Every time you feel provoked and pause before reacting, you are laying another stone. Every time an insult lands and you notice it landing on the outer wall rather than sinking into the inner chamber, you are laying another stone whether you realize it or not. It is worth remembering, too, that no city stayed standing forever simply because its walls were strong on the first day. Walls crack, gates rust, watchmen grow careless after too many quiet years without incident. The inner fortress works the same way. It requires maintenance, not because the design was flawed, but because anything built to withstand pressure eventually needs the pressure checked and the stone repaired. The people whose composure seems unshakable are rarely people who built their fortress once and forgot about it. They are people who walk the walls daily out of habit long after the last siege ended. There is an image worth holding for a long moment before we close. A bird raised its entire life in a comfortable enclosure, fed, sheltered, admired by everyone who pauses to comment on how beautiful it is, and a second bird, wild, unowned, flying somewhere over open country with no guarantee of food and no shelter from the coming weather. The first bird has real, undeniable comfort, but has traded its entire existence for the approval and convenience of whoever happens to hold the key to its enclosure. The second bird has nothing guaranteed except the freedom to be exactly what it actually is, storm or no storm. So much of human suffering comes from living like the first bird, quietly performing a version of yourself designed to please whoever happens to be watching in that moment, convinced somewhere deep down that your safety depends entirely on their approval. The Stoics insisted, in different words across different centuries, that you do not actually owe anyone that performance. You do not owe the world your compliance with expectations you never agreed to and never consciously chose for yourself. Real freedom is not the absence of hardship, no matter how comfortable that definition sounds. It is the absence of needing anyone else's permission to be exactly who you actually are underneath it all. This is a genuinely difficult kind of freedom to accept, because the enclosure really was comfortable in its own limited way, and the open sky really does come without a single guarantee attached to it. But the sheltered bird never gets to know what it was actually capable of, because it traded that knowledge away the moment it accepted comfort as an acceptable price for its own freedom. You do not owe anyone an explanation for the life you choose to build, as long as it is built with honesty, discipline, and the four qualities the Stoics kept returning to across everything they ever wrote: courage, moderation, justice, and wisdom. Everything else, every expectation, every comfortable enclosure ever offered in exchange for your own freedom, is a debt you were never actually required to pay in the first place, no matter how convincingly it was presented to you as one. No one ever builds a cage all at once. It is built slowly, one small accommodation at a time, one swallowed opinion, one abandoned interest, one quiet surrender to what was expected instead of what was true. Which means the door out is built the same patient way, one small refusal at a time, one honest opinion spoken instead of swallowed, one interest picked back up after years of neglect. 10 lessons, one thread running quietly through every single one of them. You do not control the storm, the crowd, the siege, or the hourglass, and you never actually did, no matter how hard you gripped at any of them. You control the response you choose in this exact moment. The verdict you refuse to sign without a trial. The shape the fire forces out of you when you least expect it. The rooms you choose to stand in day after day. The question you let win each morning. The losses you rehearse honestly before they arrive uninvited. The work you would still do without a single person clapping for it. The honesty you finally bring to your own mortality. The gate you refuse to open from the inside no matter how loud the siege becomes. And the cage you finally decide, one day, to leave behind for good. None of this was ever supposed to be comfortable. Comfort was never what kept Marcus Aurelius ruling through plague and betrayal, or kept Seneca writing through repeated exile, or kept Epictetus teaching for decades after years spent in actual chains. What kept them going was the brutal, clarifying knowledge that their remaining days were limited and unawed to them by anyone, and that the only real failure available to any of us in the end is spending those limited days asleep inside a life we never actually chose for ourselves. You are going to die. So am I. Neither of us knows exactly when or how, or whether there will be any warning at all before it happens. But for however many mornings you actually have left, you now carry something most people spend their entire lives quietly avoiding, the plain knowledge that the storm was never yours to control, that the light was always yours to keep burning no matter how hard the wind blew against it, and that today, this exact ordinary day, is the only day you have ever actually been given to finally start doing it. If any part of this reached you, do not let it fade by tomorrow morning the way most things do. Subscribe to Daily Stoic Wisdom, and let the next lesson find you before life eventually forces you to learn it the hard way instead, in circumstances you would never have chosen for yourself.